Hello, this is Craig Camp, and welcome to Troon Talk, where we dig deeply into Demeter biodynamic and regenerative organic certified wine growing and farming at Troon Vineyard in Oregon's Applegate Valley. This is meant to be a podcast for those that aspire to, as the Regenerative Organic Alliance says, farm like the world depends on it. These interviews will be focused on our work here at Troon Vineyard, but will also include the work of other farmers committed to regenerative agriculture. And now for today's interview. Hello, and welcome to Troon Talk, where we dig deeply into biodynamic, regenerative, organic agriculture. Today, we're going to be talking with an incredible panel of not only experts in biodynamics, but all good friends, and to talk about a really wonderful topic, Alan York, who really had a big impact on everyone in the industry. In fact, this was inspired by an article I read by Samantha Cole Johnson on Jancis Robinson's website, tracing the history of biodynamics in the Americas. And it was interesting. The one phrase that really struck me was that there's one thread that ties all of the biodynamic farms in America together, and that's Alan York. Mm-hmm. And we obviously lost him way too early in life. And I think it's important to record that history and make sure that we can pass that on. So I'd like to introduce our panel. First, our Director of Agriculture at Troon Vineyard, Garett Long. Could you tell us about yourself, Garett?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, my name is Garett Long. I came to Troon 2 years ago, but that was in my 10th year of biodynamic farming. I got my start in biodynamics alongside Alan, working at Apricot Lane Farms. After college, I arrived there very green as a woofer. I studied biology, and I was very excited to jump into learning about farming and diversified regenerative farming. And Alan was my mentor and shepherd in my journey. I took 2 quick stops, a couple of years at grad school at UC Davis studying soil science, and then about a year-long project where I was working with one of our other panelists, Andrew, on another biodynamic farm in Napa, and then came to Troon in August of 2021 as the Director of Agriculture.
Okay, and Andrew Beatty has been our biodynamic consultant since 2018, since we started down the road. Andrew was literally born on a biodynamic farm, so I think that's a lifetime in biodynamics, more than most people can claim. I feel he's the leading consultant for biodynamics right now in the United States, and his help for Troon has been it's just unimaginable. We would have accomplished without him. So, Andrew, could you tell us about your background?
Sure. I am Andrew Beatty, and like Craig said, born into a biodynamic dairy farm, and then raised in England, also on farming. So I've been around agriculture my whole life, and have been farming for the last 25 years full time, and then got into consulting and design work about 8 years ago. So now I think Garett used a good word of being a shepherd, where try and help various farms, build out their infrastructure and their individual farming practices, and help them, become more biodynamic in their approach to viticulture and agriculture in general. So.
Okay, and the next two panelists it's very exciting for me to have friends that I haven't seen in a while. Barbara and Bill Steele founded Cowhorn Vineyard and Garden in Southern Oregon. We're the leading proponents of biodynamics in Southern Oregon, and on a personal level, the reason that I'm here are Barbara and Bill. So, Barbara and Bill, just a short background on you.
Well, I came to farming. I was volunteering on farms in California after a 20-year finance career. But in the short way of saying it, I'd learned a lot about running businesses, and I felt it was time for me to give back. And within our household, we had been practicing energetic healing and homeopathy for decades. And through serendipity, I was introduced to the biodynamic community and ultimately to Alan. And it just brought together, as we talk about the history of America, the wedding of the waters to found the nation. It was sort of the wedding of all those things that happened that led Bill and I to start Cowhorn and move to Southern Oregon.
And then for me, I always say there's a long story of how I got to Cowhorn, and there's a short story. And the short story is just 2 words: yes, dear. And so I was a Wall Street guy forever. And, Barb got the passion. Barb found the property. Barb moved to Southern Oregon. And I just kind of followed along until the day where she said, I need some real help. And I'd never even been on a tractor before. So I didn't know what kind of real help I could give her. But at that point, I retired from Wall Street and became a farmer.
Wonderful. And a damn good one too, Bill. So all of you work directly with Alan. I think this is a unique group to really give a perspective on his life. Garett, can you just start the conversation there?
I was trying to think about that prior to this conversation and how to encapsulate and memorialize a man who had such incredible impact on me personally, on everybody who's present with us today, and of course on biodynamic farms and vineyards throughout the Americas. I unfortunately only knew Alan for about 3 years, from 2012 until his passing in 2015. And I think he had a real outsized impact on my development as a biodynamic farmer and influenced me in incredibly profound ways, really opened my eyes to not just what diversified farming can be, but on a real spiritual level. And I think that something that I hope we'll all be able to share stories about is Alan's humor. I think he had this incredible wittiness and silliness that paired so nicely alongside his sensibility and his practical nature and all of that. And his humor is something that I will never forget. I think it makes taking hard lessons or any sort of lesson, any sort of learning, it makes it much more enjoyable to be accompanied with that humor. But Alan, I think outside of his silliness and this part of it that really sticks with us, he is his lineage to Rudolf Steiner and the beginnings of biodynamics can be traced very directly and quite briefly, I think. And so I think maybe that's a good enough place to start is outlining some of Alan's own credibility and how he came to the US to become such an important consultant, especially in the wine industry. And so I think just starting with Rudolf Steiner himself, one of his proteges was Dr. Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, and who trained directly with Steiner and then came to the US. And Pfeiffer was encouraged by Steiner to go to the universities to get the education with the formal, education of the time in quantitative science and weight and measure and number, and then bring that sort of education back to spiritual science. And so as Pfeiffer, set up shop on the East Coast in New York, and then began to influence so many other practitioners in the US, like Josephine Porter and so on, Alan Chadwick was another one of his proteges. And I'm sure you guys could tell the story better than I can about Alan and Alan, that is Chadwick and York, meeting up in California in Santa Cruz, if I'm right. Is that correct? Is that where the Allens met?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And he studied with him for many years. I'd love to hear more detail on that part of his journey. But I think if I'm just tracing my own personal lineage, there it is, me to Alan Chadwick to Pfeiffer and right back to Steiner is a very short lineage. And I know we're talking about only 100-year-old practice that is biodynamic farming, but in that 100 years, the number of connections, mentor-mentee relationships, consultant-farmer relationships, they've been innumerable. And I think it's a really, really cool opportunity to get to share this moment with all of you and get to hear about some of your personal experiences as well.
One thing, Garett, I love that. One thing I would add to your list, which I could not have said as well as you did, is Alan always mentioned running around and growing up in Louisiana and the muddy waters.
Yep.
And the accessibility to that extraordinarily rich environment. It was, I think, what embedded the spiritual aspect and the complexity aspect that allowed him to take on something as big as biodynamic agriculture.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. I mean, I really understood Alan to be like a horticulturalist, a plantsman first and foremost. And then, of course, everything came with that, the spiritual practice, the compost, the animal management, all of that. But I knew Alan as a real plantsman. He could identify, any different plant on the farm, the garden, the forest, whatever, and tell you what it's good for. It sounds like maybe a lot of his childhood informed his knowledge of plants and just sort of maybe his feral nature growing up as a kid before moving out to California when he was just in high school, right?
15. He ran away.
Can you talk a little bit more about his childhood and how that shaped who he would become?
Oh boy. Alan at his core was a rebel. And if you ever talk to him about his family, they did not see eye to eye. In many, many ways. And I think that intellectual curiosity that drove him was what it caused him to leave Louisiana and head west. He made, as I recall, a stop in Michigan on his way. He had an apple farm. That didn't go well. And then continued the journey until, like Garett said, till he met with Alan Chadwick. And they did form a strong bond, but Alan was always his own person, very much a rebel, very much wanted to do it his way, which was the right way. And I think that's why he was such a successful consultant versus an employee, is that he could run his own ship. The other thing I would say about his journey was that Alan, as a consultant, did not have hordes of clients. If anything, he was in and around 10. And that allowed him to do such a deep dive into each of his farms that, to Garett's point, he learned each of the farms, pluses, minuses, what he would do, and he would keep notes on what he would do differently as his consultancy evolved. And we happened to meet up with him in 2003, and we were actually the first farm that he started from ground zero. Most all of Alan's, every other one was he was hired to fix. And at Cowhorn, Barb was able to share her vision with him on a brutally hot day in July of 2002, right? And we were in the middle of the farm, which at that point was nothing. There was nothing, and it was 107. But they had a common vision and of what Cowhorn could become, and it allowed Alan to use all those notes to begin something from scratch.
But Garett, I think you're right. A plantsman, and then live power happened. But you know who really knows this better is Andrew. Because Andrew, you saw it from your whole life. You probably know this
Sure.
better than any of us.
Well, I remember, so I first met Alan in, when I was 13, 14. So 93, 94 at the Biodynamic conference in Arizona or New Mexico. One of the two down there, because they were both, Alan and my dad were on the board of the Biodynamic Farming and Gardening Association. So every year they had their annual, confab. So I met him in a very early teenager, and I have this distinct memory of, we're sitting down there at this big long table with all these different farmers and gardeners and Alan and my dad and everything. And, I just come in from England because I was living over there with my mom. And being British, like ketchup is spicy. Like it's not, we don't do like hot food very well. But I remember sitting there turning to Alan, just being like, oh, like this red sauce, like, do you think it's hot? And he just looked at me and was like, nah, man, should be fine. So I dumped that all over my chicken or something. And Jesus, that was the hardest stuff like I've had to this day. And Alan just cracked up laughing. And like since then, it's good to have a grounding humor in this serious topic of biodynamics. Otherwise, you just get lost in the weeds,
Mhm.
So, yeah, I knew Alan for many years, but worked with him, I guess, on a professional level from 2008 when I moved from England to Kivera in Northern California. He was their consultant, and Kivera hired me to help them build out their gardens and orchards and bring in animals and try and diversify the property there. And then moved to Apricot Lane Farms because Alan stole me from Kivera down to Apricot. Where he passed on. Yeah, God, it's a long time ago. Amazing how time flies. But on a spiritual level, I guess my interaction with Alan on biodynamics was much more on a practical level, and that he instilled in me the benefits of building biodynamic farms or gardens or vineyards from the ground up, not coming at it from, say biodynamics down. It was like, right, okay, first we have to build the irrigation system. Then we have to find a composting pad. First we have to understand the soil. And then once we've identified the problems and the benefits that any given property has, then we can turn to our biodynamic toolbox and pull from that toolbox to either enhance the benefits or fix the problems of any given property. And I think that was the leading takeaway of my interactions with him on a professional level. Then on a personal level, just like having like a good friend, just like someone you can just sit by his pool and, smoke a little bit of weed. And him and my dad would outdo me every time on that. But it was just like, you have to bring enjoyment to the work, right? Otherwise, like, what are we doing? Like, it doesn't matter how many times you apply 501 or 500 or how many horns you bury and all that kind of stuff. If you don't have an enlightened, observant enjoyment for the practice at hand, then, well, it's just going to be a really dull life. And
Yeah,
Alan certainly brought a lot of light and professionalism to every interaction. But now, like, I still ask him questions now, even though, like, he's obviously not here. But I've definitely found that the difference of asking him questions when he was alive and now asking him questions, in the after his passing. He only works union hours. He doesn't, no weekends, no evening calls, very strict, time off. It's funny. He generally gets back to me. It's just quite funny. But yeah.
You're reminding me, Andrew, of my first meetings with Alan as well, which, as we both, or as I said earlier, was at Apricot Lane Farms in Ventura County. And I arrived there as a woofer, worldwide opportunities on organic farms. It was a work trade program. And I signed up for a 3-month work trade gig. And I moved from Washington State, where I grew up and went to college, and moved down to Southern California. And I think it was just fortuitous. I think sort of like the first or second week I was there was one of Alan's monthly visits that he did out to the farm, one of his consulting trips for a couple of days. And, he would stay on site and we'd get those opportunities to share meals. I unfortunately was not sitting poolside with him during those early days, as you said, but we got to share meals and talk shop over over meals. And it was really amazing to have this world-class renowned consultant come out and to have him just sit down with a bunch of us, early 20-somethings who were passionate, sure, but we weren't sure what we were passionate about. And I remember recounting to Alan that I had fallen in love with plants only just a few years ago. I was working a technician job in a biology lab at a community college, just setting up and taking down labs. And there was an old greenhouse that was there. And the plants were all kind of crispy and fried and pot bound and unhappy. And they're mostly succulents anyway. So they were taking it. But I shared with him that I just lost myself volunteering in that greenhouse. I would finish up my shift and I'd go down there in the afternoon, early afternoon, and I just get lost. I'm up potting plants. I'm Googling, trying to figure out identification of all these plants, and the sun would set and I wouldn't notice the passing of time, and I wouldn't notice dinner time coming and going, and I just was lost in the work. And he goes in his kind of accent, I think we should all probably try to imitate Alan at some point today, but he said, you know, that sounds like that 10,000 hours stuff. And I didn't know. I hadn't read Malcolm Gladwell at the time, but he's referring to, you know, Gladwell's idea that you become a master only after practicing something for 10,000 hours, and that in that practice you find yourself getting lost in whatever you're doing. And so he was a great source of encouragement for me in my early days of just recognizing how that story, how I didn't even see it in myself, but recognizing how my own getting lost in working with plants and just communing with plants is how I would describe it, was a very early step in my own journey to becoming a biodynamic farmer and learning everything that I've learned in the last 10 years. Alan was really encouraging for the most part along the way, although there was one challenge that he made to me when I told him in 2014 that I was applying for grad school and that I was going to leave Apricot Lane to go to grad school. He told me, well, if you want to be a biodynamic farmer, you should work on a biodynamic farm. You don't need to go, you know, get a master's degree to learn about biodynamic farming. And I was also advised, I think the same thing by Andrew, by Matthias Baker, who was also a consultant on the project. I think all of these mentors who I thought very highly of all told me, don't go to grad school. And I unfortunately ignored all of them and went anyway. And I learned a lot while I was there, but I was thinking about that advice. And I was wondering if you guys had any examples of when Alan might have given you advice that either didn't resonate with you or felt in conflict with what you wanted to do, and how you managed that. Did you end up taking his advice or disregarding it?
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, he may have told you not to go to grad school, but there were complex reasons why he told you that, because that man read more textbooks on college and graduate level soil science than anybody. So I think that may have been, you know, maybe take him telling you not to go and do that not as strongly, because he was very knowledgeable about textbook science.
Yeah.
He just wanted to reduce some competition in the industry, maybe.
Well, that's how you make biodynamics work, is you have to have that analytical view and the biodynamic view. Otherwise it just doesn't work. It just, in this day and age, Alan instilled that you have to have both those point of views. Neither one is right, neither one is wrong, but you need both. And that's where his systems, you know, worked. Because, you know, if you hire a biodynamic consultant and the first thing they want to do is bury cow swarms, then, well, you're not off to the right start, right? Right? There's a certain amount of steps and they have to be or should be performed in a chronological order to enable the foundation to be built where biodynamics can, you know, thrive. That was definitely a lesson from Alan.
You know, I think listening to you two, I think that I hear so many things from both of you, the sense of humor, the advice you maybe should analyze a little bit more before you take it, because Alan was a seriously intelligent person who masqueraded as being an unintelligent, uneducated person.
Right.
But our experience with Alan was quite different. So we did not have the educational experience that you folks had. But we had the vision to create something like Apricot Lane before Apricot Lane was such a thing. And as Bill mentioned, it wasn't a Band-Aid project. So Bill also mentioned that Alan was very selective in his client list. I think he had 9, maybe 8 when he took us on. And the way you worked with Alan was extremely intensive. So we spent 10 years going from six times a year to 4 times a year, where we would spend 2.5 to 3 days together at Cowhorn. And it's that kind of immersion into the cycle of the weather, the cycle of the elements and interplay that we gained together with Alan to watch Cowhorn unfold and then be taken. We never lost sight of the fact that it's agriculture. It's not a whim. It's not nature. It's agriculture. But we didn't have a mentorship relationship. We had an experience of living together for 2.5 days repeatedly for nearly 10 years.
12.
Yeah, well, maybe, I guess 12 years.
Mm.
And at that point, you can't cook together, dine together,
Work all day.
smoke dope together, or whatever you're going to do, work all day, get up, and then have those peaceful morning hours together without gaining a really clear understanding of another person's soul.
Mm-hmm.
And through that process, I think you're able to practice biodynamic practices in a different way than some of the other folks who, like one of you referred to, well, bury your horns. That's what you have to do today. That has such a reductionist orientation to it. Whereas Alan brought a holistic approach. His business practices, his analytical research, his spiritual commitment, and his willingness to get in the dirt were holistic. And that's the way he operated with his long-term clients. So our relationship with Alan was really, and Roseanne was really, and August was very intimate, very, very intimate.
Yeah, very intense. I don't think we ever really disagreed with him, that I can recall. There wasn't, I think we all looked up to him. And, I quickly ascertained that Alan meant business, but he wanted to see some progress. And so what I remember that first year, 2003, and Alan would come up and every 6 weeks-ish. And he would give us, okay, here are the 16 things that you need to do before I show up in 6 weeks. And it was just 3 of us, Barb, myself, and one other guy, Martine. And we'd work our tails off for those 6 weeks. And we'd get the last thing done the day before he gets there. And we'd have all of our notes and all of our data and everything, binders. And here's what we did. And here's how we did it. And Alan would look at that and he'd be, that's great. That's great. And we would talk about it. Don't get me wrong. But then by two days later, he'd say, okay, here's the 15 things now that you need to do before I show up in 6 weeks. So I think we just kind of fell into this, I guess it's a mentor relationship, but it was pretty much that, we did everything that Alan said. I think he was surprised by that at times, that we were willing to do whatever he said to do. We would do it.
Sounds like slavery. That's the Alan that I know. I remember sometimes, just having these interactions of, like you said, with the lists and everything, this kind of project list. And then sometimes it'd be like, Alan's response would be like, Jesus, you did it all.
Yeah, right.
Here's another one.
Yeah. Maybe I should give you more things to do next.
Yeah, we need a bigger binder.
Yeah. Well, we had binders for everything. That's another story. There was a lady from Seattle, reporter, came down when Alan was there and wanted to talk to us and Alan about biodynamics. And we still have a bunch of binders for Cowhorn, everything that we measured. And we're, Alan's talking about everything that we measure and, this, that, and the other. And finally she looked up and she was kind of glazed over and she said, well, yeah, I don't really understand all this, but when does the chanting begin? And she never wrote an article because having binders on the front page of the Seattle Times, not going to sell newspapers, but certainly chanting would.
Chanting would.
Yeah. So anyway, it was that was another introduction to biodynamics, was just how rigorous he was in terms of data collection and data analysis.
Yeah, like that soil study we did at Troon, like when we first started working together at Troon, and obviously not with Alan, but speaking of data collection, we did that 1 pit per acre with a huge amount of data. So that was like 70, 80 pits, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And through that data collection early on is where you have your success.
Yep.
And it was always funny about that to me. We did that. We did it to the 1/4 acre, and you
Nice.
you never stop going back to that. And then remember when drones became a thing in agriculture, and they'd come out and they'd come to Calvert and they're like, we can do this for you. We can show you. And their data was so weak. It was so broad, because after you'd done those soil pits, what you knew was so much more.
Right.
That always cracked me up.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting balance between the practical side of biodynamics versus the dogmatic side. That's something Andrew and I've discussed many times, and I'm getting the impression from you guys that Alan was extremely practical, and I think Andrew carries that same flavor into his consulting work. I've certainly been inspired by that. Was there anything Alan was really dogmatic about or sort of insistent, going back to Steiner, the primary literature, and saying, no, it really needs to be chamomile, not that local pineapple weed stuff you guys have growing everywhere?
Oh, there was no half measures.
Yeah.
I know Bill and Bob can speak more about that, being on the receiving end of his guidance. But like, if you want to do biodynamics with Alan, you have to do biodynamics. You can't do biodynamics light, like it's sort of,
Right.
If we're going to do this, if we're going to sign up with each other and we're going to build this professional and also, as Bob mentioned, a personal relationship, then, well, you better be committed. Because I certainly am. Alan was like, well, I am. And if you're not, this relationship ain't going to work. It's just.
And I think that he was dogmatic about while you may not become involved in the product paradigm of conventional farming, you would be foolish if you didn't pay attention to the mechanical advances in conventional farming and the results of conventional farming and the knowledge about the way invasive weeds were mutating and the way compost was, products were showing up in compost and not composting away. I feel like he never said one should shy away from what could be learned from conventional farming.
Because if we do that, if we just, turn inward to our little biodynamic bubble, then, well, that's just a very limited, you completely limited the availability of biodynamics to go beyond your farm. And having Alan's, outward looking view and in the conventional side is a key component of how biodynamics can go further. We can't just be in our little, whatever, cow horn bubble.
It's amazing that he almost every biodynamic winery on the West Coast has a direct lineage to Alan. What do you think it was about him that his message has been so broadly spread?
He was successful.
Yeah, I think that's it. That's it in a nutshell. If you were one of his clients, so one time I remember someone saying to me, you brought biodynamic practices to Southern Oregon. That's not really how it happened. What happened was you joined in to Alan's global client base. You joined into a conversation for us, which was with Benziger and Matatek, and what was that one of the Stings place called? I can't remember.
Forgot Stings place. Yeah.
Tuscany one. What was that called? I can't remember.
Yeah.
Quivera, you joined in to a conversation globally that inevitably folks like yourself, you moved from Quivera to Apricot Lane Farm, so you joined his practice and his practice spread. That's how I saw it happening.
I mean, I always like to think of it, his approach to biodynamics was, planting the seed and then helping people, cultivate it and grow it and build it and nurture it and care for it, So and like you said, he's successful. And if you are serious in your work and take somewhat of a light-hearted view of some of the stranger things of biodynamics, then where you just allow other people to, grow their own biodynamic practices.
Speaking of the incredible network that Alan cultivated, I don't think I had a real sense of that. And even to this day, I continue to have my eyes opened, and it's revealed to me again how impactful Alan was, again, not just on the wine industry, but the biodynamic movement at large. And going back to my own journey and involving UC Davis and academic study, it was at Alan's memorial, actually, at Benziger in 2015. I had just arrived at Davis, and I had the opportunity to just, jump across over to Sonoma or Glen Ellen and attend his memorial. And it was there that I got to meet so many people who clearly had these stories like we're sharing today. And one of them was John Regenold. He's a professor at Washington State University. And there's a lineage from Dr. Regenold to Lynn Carpenter Boggs to Jennifer Reeve. There's this whole lineage of academics, of researchers who have taken on, I think, the difficult challenge of studying biodynamics in using those sort of quantitative, rigorous, land grant university approaches to understanding agriculture, and seriously including biodynamic treatments in their research. And that was really profound to me, to be just taking my first step into grad school and getting to meet somebody the likes of John Regenold, who had collaborated with Alan on multiple studies and looking at the influence of the preps on compost making, or looking at soil and wine grape quality across the whole industry as a result of this transition to biodynamic practices. And so Dr. Regenold is just one person who I got to meet at his memorial, of course, too late. But his network was really profound and global. Like you said, his client list and his impact was really global, as much as his focus may have been sort of on the West Coast or on the Americas here. That was really incredible to me to realize how deep that went.
Before we move on to talking about biodynamics in Southern Oregon, I think we would be remiss if we did not mention Paul Dolan here, who just passed away, and all of you knew. We can maybe say a few words about Paul.
Well, that's one thing Paul couldn't do. Right. Say a few words. Sorry, that was just such a straight line, and everybody that knows Paul knows what I'm referring to.
A 5-minute coffee is, so funny. Just before he passed, I didn't even know that he passed. I was just texting him like the day before, because I found one of his wines in a wine shop. I forget where it was. Go ahead.
I think for me, I did a couple panels with Paul, and we didn't know each other very well. But he had a very important and long association with someone who I'm close to. So he knew of me, and he just wanted to be as supportive of another person who wanted to walk lightly on the earth, who was not afraid of taking risks to advance the way we think about farming in places like Northern California that are populated and don't really have wild space left for farming. That was my takeaway. He just wanted to be a supporting word saying, keep at it.
Mm-hmm. And again, he was part of the biodynamic network that Barb's talked about. When we had questions, we could always reach out to, Doug or Paul or Alan or whoever, and the thing is that the biodynamic community is so responsive. And to your point with Paul, so supportive that it just felt like we were part of a large community, and we just happened to be in Southern Oregon, but that's like what Barb said. We just happened to be there, but the community was much larger and much more interactive.
So Barbara and Bill, you brought biodynamics to Southern Oregon along with Ellen York. Could we just dig deeper now into the Cowhorn story and just recall how you established Cowhorn?
Sure. So I had been volunteering in KPay mainly and decided that I wanted to start an integrated farm. And through serendipity and a lot of hard work, met with Alan. But for me, Cowhorn was a slow journey to create a healthy ecosystem that would reveal itself over time. So it started off as it was going to be annuals and a vineyard. And there was some consternation over that when Alan said, no, your plan is like a hobby. You need to make it bigger. So there were a lot of conversations about that. And within a year, we learned that Cowhorn was the site, which for those who haven't seen it, it's quite remote, backed up against a ridge that heads off into the wilds of the Rogue River National Forest. So we quite quickly learned that the site was too cold for most annuals. So I switched up and turned the plan into become a perennial polyculture. And in that is where the master plan originated from, and the way that Cowhorn looks today unfolded. It was really after a whole year, after 2 years of collecting climate data and building roads, it was a whole year after that the perennial polyculture was established and the vineyard was planted. Yeah.
I mean, there's stories, going back to Alan, how did we meet Alan? We met Alan, Barb met him through Bob Blue over at Bonterra. So Barb's, heard something about biodynamics, heard something about, Alan, called up Bob Blue and said, you know what, I'd like to meet this Alan York guy. And Bob goes, sure. And so Alan's there the next week, and right around 11 o'clock, Bob goes out and says, I'd like you to take some time to talk to this lady who's thinking about biodynamics. And without sounding like Alan, I'm sure there was an F-bomb dropped, but he basically told Bob, you're paying me, I'll do whatever you want. And so he sat down with Barb and at Bonterra, and then, an hour or so later, Barb was convinced, and Alan was convinced enough to drive up to Southern Oregon to see what became Cowhorn. So that's how we met him. And then there's one other short story with Alan, and this was kind of the come to Jesus dinner we had at the Fig and the Goat. Is that it? Girl and the Fig. So we sat down with Alan, just the three of us, and he just tried to scare us silly. Just, this is impossible. Nobody's ever done it. You're not qualified. You've not been on a tractor. And Barb and I just sat there and smiled. Oh yeah, we can do it. We can do it. And he just, after that dinner, was convinced that we were the real deal. at least in his eyes, and that we would listen, and we were fully committed.
Yeah, so the story of Cowhorn becoming a wine producer all came after all of that.
Yeah.
It was a meshing of our personalities, the broadness of the view, the willingness to take a risk on a new site, and Alan's visit to the site. He had eyes capable of seeing the riverbed. This is old Cowhorn's on old riverbed. And the impact of having an alluvial fan next to a granitic ridge, and he had the vision to see that with owners who would take risks and physically work it themselves, there was a lot that could be done. Then the wine story happened. That's kind of how it started.
So we've got 4 of the most knowledgeable people on the planet about biodynamic farming in Southern Oregon. Andrew, I remember when you first came here, you said that this was an ideal place to farm biodynamically. Why is that?
Well, if you go 1,000 feet to the south, you drop down off of that ledge to the river valley, and your humidity goes through the roof and your wind speeds drop through the floor. So your disease pressure goes up. Whereas at Troon, just looking at the climate and the topography and the space around it, it's like, well, of course it's going to work. The only limiting factor is if we really screw it up, and we try and minimize that by, collecting all the data first, and, everything that we've been talking about. But you can very much tell right off the bat if biodynamics can work or will help a farm, or if the relationship with the customer is the right fit or a wrong fit. Both of those points have to work. And as Bill was saying, it's good to establish the commitment first, as Alan did with them at their first meeting. We established our commitment very early on, and that just allows for both a more productive and cohesive and holistic, any term you want to use for biodynamic system, but it also enables the growth in my professional growth, as well as the professional growth of the client and the customer. So one thing I've been thinking about in the last, whatever it is, an hour we've been talking, is when Alan passed away, too soon, granted, but on the other hand, to my knowledge, the vast majority of all his clients and all his farms and all his interactions over his life are still successful. I'm sure there's an outlier that is not, but you can really see in that success of his clients beyond his passing is that he did a pretty sound job in allowing other people to continue to build their biodynamics, whether he's there or not. And that's where you get a takeaway of a leader in biodynamics and a leader in how to help people in general.
Yeah, I think one thing Alan would often say is that his goal was for us to get rid of him. And he did not want to work with somebody that just in perpetuity needed help. So if you weren't bought in and committed, he was going to cut you loose. And I think that's, to Andrew's point, all of his clients are successful because he's already vetted them. They are committed, and to doing the biodynamic thing. And if you have that, I've always said that intent matters. That's my phrase, intent matters. And so, if you intend to do something, you're committed to doing, it will work. You're going to be throwing curveballs, but it will work. And I think we've all seen that.
Well, like if you're just on as an example, if one is willing to take chamomile and put it in a, an intestine, then there's a certain amount of commitment that you've demonstrated right there. And just to tie that back to biodynamics in Southern Oregon, I'm just going to use Troon as the example. Troon is one of the few clients that I have that actually makes all the preparations on site to a high quality every year. And that's not to say that there's been examples of, really crap 500 because we put it in the wrong area. But if you work with people to build their farms so they can do it without you, then, well, that's how you guys are going to be successful, and how there's more biodynamics. There's always more biodynamic farms coming than there are throwing up their hands and walking away from.
It's interesting, the story, Barbara, that you were sharing about Alan challenging you to make your vision bigger, to dream bigger. It's not my personal story, but the story that's told in the Biggest Little Farm documentary that John and Molly Chester share about their experience working with Alan. It's from their perspective, but I think Molly shared with me that he really challenged her on the vision of the development of what they'd call the fruit basket, 75 different varieties of fruit and nut trees planted across 22 acres, just intense diversity in a very small area. Andrew probably tell you, being the guy who managed that for
It was
years.
such a pain in the ass to farm, but it was
really
beautiful.
Gorgeous. And there's something to pick pretty much all year round. There's something, beautifully harvestable. But I think Molly went through a similar experience that you might have had as well, Barbara, where she shared a vision for a fruit orchard, and he was like, no, more, make it bigger, dream bigger. And it's so cool that sort of like challenge to the client to dream bigger, and I'll do it with you. I'll be by your side. I'll help guide this, but let's dream bigger. That all led to the success and the continued legacy that you're all describing of all of these clients.
That is insightful, Garett. It's true what you're saying, that similarity, but it's also quite different. My aesthetic is simplicity, not complexity. My aesthetic is to enjoy solitary bees, not colonies of visible beehives. And that never became the conversation with Alan. It was in stark contrast to his other clients. And there were certainly reasons beyond just a personal aesthetic. Cowhorn is a rugged site, and it has intense coldness at times, and it has overbearing heat. It has a nutrient poor soil with zero water holding capacity. It had owners who didn't have resources to bring in many laborers to do stuff. None of that was the issue. A beauty of biodynamic agriculture is the ability for the people who work the land to make it their own. And so that happened right away. I didn't want that feeling of competition. So I wanted really peaceful spaces, and that led to a decision. For example, we had a big departure in our strategy when the wine turned out to be better than anyone thought it would be. I will leave that conversation to Bill. But the other thing that happened is neither Bill nor I wanted to bring farm animals in. The Applegate Valley has farm animals everywhere, right next door to us. Well, such as there was a next door to us, there were farm animals. But what there are wildlife corridors, and we wanted to farm with the wild. Well, that required a big conversation with Demeter. That required Alan to be open-minded about it, and all of that worked. And it took a decade. It took a decade to see the results. Now, the results were more than we could have hoped for. more than we could have imagined. We had on our site, together with our customers who would be there on the weekends, an interactive, diverse population of wildlife where we could see the cycles. We could see the cycles of small, large, medium size. We could see the cycles of warm and cold. We could see the birth through the death. And that was profound. But it was so super different than like what you're talking about at Lane's. I mean, it's so different because it was about creating wild spaces and peaceful spaces. A lot of times that doesn't look like much to someone, but it sure takes a lot of work. And Alan is never afraid of a lot of work.
Yeah, we kind of built a little movie set sort of there. It was a very high functioning farm, but ended up being the set for the documentary. And I'm sure Cowhorn, I mean, I know, having been out there several times, that Cowhorn also is worthy of documentation on film. But you're right, it's a very different kind of rugged beauty, and yeah, it's a ruggedness that I think is reflective of Southern Oregon compared to kind of the movie set that is just 1 hour outside of LA. So, I mean, this is a really unique context, a really unique climate to be farming grapes and to really be further catalyzing this biodynamic movement right here in this part of the state.
Andrew, your career is a direct in a direct line with what we've been talking about. You're now the consultant. Where is that going in the future as we try to expand biodynamics?
Well, there are many consultants out there. But I guess in my work, there's a lot more interest in bringing biodynamics into the textile fiber industry, working on for a fashion company in LA who wants to grow their own biodynamic cotton and hemp and linen or flax. There's two goals. One, taking as much of that high intensity, high waste that is the textile industry, and moving that as much as possible to a more regenerative or biodynamic organic approach to that production. And then also the other motive is you end up with a higher quality product. There's nothing wrong with using biodynamics to build or grow or harvest or make just a better high quality product, whether it's wine or fiber or doing avocados in Chile, or there's also work in China, but that's a whole different level of. I mean, we talked earlier about the chronological approach that Alan instilled in probably all of us, of the steps to move to biodynamics, and just using the work in China as an example. Looking at the organic demonstration farm of Beijing with these guys, because the government runs everything over there, and they turned to me and was like, okay, so what's the first step that we should be taking there? Well, we're not at the stage of adding preps to their compost. We're at the stage of, well, first let's stop adding plastic debris into the compost and trying to compost it. That's the different levels of biodynamics, both in Asia and the South, and then here, is each farm has a different starting point. I mean, Bill and Barb were talking about their ground up build of Cowhorn. There's other farms that we need to stop putting plastic in the compost as our first step. So it's just, there's so much opportunity out there for biodynamics to grow. I think Bill mentioned that, Alan was successful And in the farms that I work with, you have to have that financial, we can't just jump up and down about how much biodynamic compost we throw around. We actually need to pay our mortgage, So you have to build, if biodynamics wants to move forward and grow, then in the 21st century, then, well, we need to make some money and pay our mortgage and, all that kind of stuff. So, helping farms not just gather data to identify the practices that biodynamics will help with on the farm, but also in Craig and his planning of, we have to be financially solvent. And that's where biodynamics can demonstrate not just a higher quality product that is better for the environment, but that also can generate more revenue, which will then allow for an expansion of biodynamics, But yeah, there's so many different levels of the starting off point. It's so interesting, so varied. Apricot Lane is an extreme example of, like a movie set. Then there's Calhoun in a very tough climate, ground up build. There's Troon, which was a conversion from conventional. What was the last product they used? I forget. It was like some Venom. That's it. Yeah. It was like, well, that's gonna work. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it just doesn't sound very biodynamic. So there's but you can really feel of how biodynamics can and does work on various farms by just the initial interaction, like when you pull up to Troon, just using that as an example again, you're driving through this like thick fog, in the fall mornings, and then you sort of come around the corner to Troon, and it's like this like spiritual, like the clouds part and the sun starts shining. It's like, shit, man, look at that biodynamics. Look what it does. It might also just be topography as well.
No, Andrew, you totally nailed it. You have totally nailed it.
I tried to not swear. I really tried, but I failed. Sorry, Craig.
The expression, though, at Troon is that it is a parting of the clouds, and I love the term movie set, because I don't think Troon is a movie set, but it wouldn't be a cow horn either. It's a beautiful thing about the complexity of the mind really being able to express itself on the complexity of each different site. I love that you're seeing that in your consultancy.
Yeah, it's amazing, the transformation. It really is. But that's only, having, just being the lowly shepherd or consultant on various farms. And again, from Alan, that's only one part of it, right? That's just one small part. Whereas you guys and Troon and Southern Oregon and beyond, it's the commitment of the client or the farmer or the gardener or the lowly tractor driver it shines through in the quality of the wine or the soil or the preps or any other part of that business. And that's not like taking this kind of hippie view, or I forget, I'm not quite sure of the right term, but it really does. I'm just talking about the preps, and biodynamics, because that's what biodynamics is kind of known for. The preps are almost like the not just the shepherd or the guide for the compost, they're also the guide for the farmers, and the gardeners, and they can really help through their energy bring a more observant and intuitive view of the farm or vineyard. And again, the preps don't, not all about, it's probably 50% for the compost and 50% for the actual farmer or the gardener or whoever's making them. They almost guide those two parts equally.
That's something that I'm really picking up, hearing Barb and Bill tell their stories, and something that I feel, Andrew, that you have in common with Alan in terms of your approach to consultancy. And it's written right into the primary tenets of biodynamic agriculture, which is that the farm is an expression of the farm or farmers and the land stewards. And that's really generous, kind words you have, Barbara, about the feel of Troon and the parting of the clouds. And I think it's something that Andrew's done a great job of, that Craig and our owners, Brian and Denise White, have done a great job of, is to design a operation or a biodynamic program around the people who are here. And Nate Wall, our winemaker, has had an incredible influence on the development, not just of the varietals that are selected, but planning for many, many years down the line for health and this real longevity in the vineyards, as well as the cider apple orchard being a reflection of his experience in making cider. I had this incredible opportunity this year to plant out a permaculture style food forest, or another perennial polyculture. That was one that was my own vision, and alongside Andrew and the rest of the team here, got to develop this, and with the support of Craig and the owners, I feel this immense amount of support for the development of these different elements, and they're true reflections of us as the folks stewarding this land. Just as Cowhorn is a reflection of you guys. And it's really cool to sit here, in my mid-30s, and reflect upon how this is a basic tenet, and we all say this. And I get this opportunity in November to go to the annual Biodynamic Conference and meet the incredibly diverse demographics who show up, who are inspired by biodynamics.
It's an eclectic bunch.
An eclectic bunch, for sure. All kinds of people find biodynamics resonate with us and get into it in our own ways. And I think that's a really special ability for a consultant to apply what is a very broad lens, and end up with these incredibly successful examples across the board in all different kinds of climates all around the world, different products. And we use this one lens to come up with very diverse but similarly successful outcomes. And I'm reminded of one last thing that I wanted to make sure that I say before we go, which is Alan raised a son as well. And August York knows, we all know August is maybe as well as we know Alan in some ways, but I had this opportunity to bring August into Apricot Lane. I remember I was coordinating the volunteer program, and Alan gave me a heads up that his son was going to apply to be a woofer, just the way that I started. And so I set up this interview with August, where he was on a bike trip. He was, cross country biking, and he was in Joshua Tree, and he was going to bike outside the park to go get service for our interview. And I remember kind of doubting that it was going to happen. I was like, this is Alan's son, like, it's got to happen. And I had this like incredibly intense and exciting conversation with August. And I realized that, this guy already knew so much more than me, but he was very humble and very grounded. And he showed up and he worked alongside Andrew and I for a couple of months. And he eventually got hired on to run the whole compost, vermicompost, and compostee program at Apricot Lane. And August and I worked together for many years, just both cutting our teeth alongside Alan and Andrew. And that was a really cool experience. And something you mentioned earlier about Alan's openness to conventional farming practices, tools, equipment, et cetera. There's a real relevance there. And I think August continues to carry his father's legacy, in not just in consulting folks with biodynamics, but also just really trying to move the needle on agriculture, regenerative agriculture at large, and working with much larger scale clients. And I think that vision for scaling up biodynamics can take many different forms. It can be a larger scale 1,000-acre farm in the Midwest that August might be consulting on their corn and soy and just getting them to till less and use cool biological products and that sort of thing. Or it could be a vision of scaling up biodynamics, which is a lot of small scale farms or little hubs here and there that all start to grow and eventually meet each other and develop these regional groups, et cetera. And I think they're both really cool versions of scaling up biodynamics that I see as the future of this movement, as well as more of these small hubs and also more collaboration, more participatory collaboration between farmers and the land that we're stewarding. And yeah, I'm really moved by this conversation in memory of Alan and thinking about his incredible abilities to shepherd that.
So Barbara and Bill, support is, I think, what defines biodynamic farmers, the support for each other.
Mhm.
Your support of our work at Troon here it really made the difference for us. And I think it's the reason Troon has succeeded in our biodynamic quest. That sharing experience with you was very special, and what you did at Cowhorn is very special. And we feel that Troon is an extension of your work, and we wanted to continue what you built.
Oh,
Thank you.
That is high praise, because Bill and I are just tickled when you should see the sunflowers that we grew. I think Bill posted some, the seeds from you folks. I made this whole big pitch about my aesthetic for simplicity. Well, we have now that we're city people, we have this city small backyard, and it is insane. There isn't an inch that isn't now coming alive at this point, only with grubs and stuff. But there's stuff going on everywhere, and this riot of sunflowers came up amongst these. We're building a rose trellis. We really like these high climbing roses, and they're kind of hard to get. They've been hybridized away to get them to climb high, and so this riot of sunflowers came up, and it just tickles us that your product is coming to us in this interconnected way that you're talking about, because Jim Fulmer said it right. The critters, the energy, they all know how to get from my yard in the southern part of the state over to somebody's yard in Arizona, over to Northern California, and up to Oregon. They know how to do it already. And if only the people will catch up in that interconnectedness. So I've just proved myself a little bit of a flip-flopper by telling you now that my practices are insanely complicated.
Well, I've actually got another story regarding inspiration, since we all inspire each other. When we first decided, with Alan, of course, that we were going to do grapes, it was within days that I got a call from Mike Benzinger, and Mike said, "Come on down, I'll show you what I do and why." And I did, and spent like 4 or 5 days there, and then promptly got home. And then Doug Tunnell at Brickhouse said, "Come on up north, I'll show you what I do and why." And it's that kind of community that I think we all inspire each other. And so thank you, Craig, for your kind words, but boy, watching what you guys do inspires us. Maybe not to go back and be farmers again, not that far, but boy, I envy you guys. It's a great project, and it's been, I mean, I'm speaking for myself. It just went so much farther, than Alan would be proud to see, he would be really proud to go to Troon and see what you guys have done.
It's very special to feel that we may have played a small role in getting you guys together and on doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
It's pretty special to feel that way. So thank you for saying that.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's been a wonderful conversation. We've strayed over our hour a bit, but that's okay, because we probably could keep going for longer. but thank you for joining us, and we look forward to actually seeing you all in person.
Look forward to it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
What a pleasure.
We are happy to share this podcast from Troon Vineyard, a Demeter Biodynamic and Regenerative Organic certified winery in Oregon's Applegate Valley. We farm like the world depends on it, by growing produce in our gardens and naturally crafting authentic wines. We will be sharing these in-depth podcasts several times a month. To learn more, I encourage you to visit our website at troonvineyard.com and those of the Regenerative Organic Alliance at regenorganic.org and Demeter Biodynamics at demeter-usa.org. Thanks for sharing our voyage to regenerative agriculture with us.